What if I told you that Africa has a country that was founded by free slaves from the United States and the Caribbean? The history of this nation is rooted in freedom, identity, struggle, and resilience. Welcome to Liberia, Africa's first republic. Yeah, you heard it right. Africa's very first republic. And today I'm taking you through the streets, not just to show you around, but also to share with you the history of this country. A country whose very name comes from the word free, like liberty. Before Liberia existed, the region was home to numerous indigenous ethnic groups, such as the Pele, the Bassa, the Kru, Gio, Mana, etc. So they traded with neighboring regions, they developed their own system of governance long before the European ships appeared, along the coast. These communities were thriving. Then the European traders arrived. So the coastline became known to the Europeans as part of the grain coast because it was valuable for grains and spices. Over time, the Atlantic slave trade transformed West Africa, and millions of Africans were taken across the Atlantic. We all know the story. After the Europeans arrived, families were separated, communities were disrupted, and the effect would be felt for generations. But little did anyone know that descendants of those, enslaved Africans would one day return. Now, the return to Africa. So, in the early 1800s, discussions began in the US about establishing a colony in Africa for free black Americans. The first batch of settlers arrived in 1822, and many of them faced incredible hardships, disease, harsh condition, conflicts, and it wasn't easy, but they persisted. And over time, more settlers arrived from the US and others came from the Caribbean. Together, these groups shaped the emerging society. The settlement gradually expanded, communities developed, institutions were established, a new society was forming, including the indigenous people that were already in the land. In 1847, Liberia declared independence and Africa had its first republic. Imagine at a time when Africa had not yet experienced formal European colonization, Liberia became an independent republic. So it was a historic moment, and this country has a unique history. The story is different, the challenges also different. Independence did not solve every challenge. So as the nation developed, questions began to emerge about power, representation, who would govern the country, whose voices would be heard. Remember now that there are two groups of people now in the land, that is the settler population and the indigenous people. Of course, the settlers brought with them political systems, customs, religious traditions, and social structures influenced by their experiences abroad. Over time, they became known as Americo Liberians. Meanwhile, the indigenous communities who had lived in the region for generations, started feeling excluded from political power and decision making. This created divisions that influenced Liberia for decades. Despite all the tensions, Liberia continued to grow. So, Monrovia, which is the capital, expanded, trade increased, new schools, churches, and businesses emerged, and Liberia worked on establishing itself on the international stage. Liberia developed diplomatic relationships with countries around the world and became an important symbol of black self governance during an era when colonial rule dominated much of Africa. So, as the European powers divided large portions of Africa during the late 19th century, Liberia fought to maintain its independence and sovereignty. This, my friend, was no small achievement. Many African nations would spend decades under colonial rule before gaining independence. Liberia, however, remained an independent republic. The country also became involved in regional, international affairs, supporting efforts that promoted African cooperation and self determination. However, beneath the surface, unresolved inequalities continued to grow. Political power remained concentrated among the settlers. Economic opportunities were not equally distributed, so the indigenous people sought greater inclusion and representation. Although the nation was growing, the question of identity, citizenship, political participation would continue to shape Liberia's future. So, guys, before we continue, here are a few fascinating facts about Liberia. Fact number one: Liberia is Africa's oldest republic, declaring independence on July 26, 1847. Fact number two: Monrovia, Liberia's capital city, was named after James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States. I don't know why, but we digress. Fact number three: Liberia's motto. Oh my god, I love this one. The love of liberty brought us here. Number four: Liberia is one of the only two African countries that were never formally colonized by European power, and the other is Ethiopia. Number five: Liberia is the only African country that its citizenship is by race. So if you're not of the Negro descent, you cannot become a citizen. Number six: the Va people of Liberia developed one of Africa's few indigenous writing systems, and it's known as the Va script. You should check it out. Now let's go back to our story. We were talking about growth and tension. So after the growth and tension came economic change and a rubber company called Firestone. As Liberia entered the 20th century, economic development became one of the country's greatest priorities. And so the government sought foreign investments that could help modernize, the economy and create new opportunities. And one of the most significant moments came in 1926 when the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company secured a major concession agreement in Liberia. At that time, rubber was becoming increasingly valuable around the world. The automobile industries were expanding rapidly and the demand for rubber was growing. So, Firestone saw Liberia as an ideal location for rubber production. So, large rubber plantations were established, thousands of Liberians found employment in the rubber sector, roads, infrastructures were developed to support the industry, and rubber quickly became one of Liberia's most important exports. For decades, it played a major role in the national economy. The partnership brought economic opportunities, but it also sparked debates. Some believed that foreign investment was essential for development. Others questioned whether Liberia was becoming too dependent on outside companies in global markets. Despite the debates, there is no denying the impact Firestone had on Liberia's economy. So, for generations, rubber became closely linked to Liberia's identity and economic growth. And as the country moved further to the 20th century, new political pressures were beginning to come up. By the 1970s, Liberia was changing. The country had experienced decades of rule under the American Liberians, that is, the settlers, and so the indigenous Liberians were increasingly calling for reform. They could not take the marginalization anymore and they wanted greater political participation. The demand for change was growing. Then in April 1980, Liberia experienced one of the most significant events in its history. A son of the indigenous people known as Master Sergeant Samuel Doe led a military coup that overthrew President William R. Torbert Jr. Now, President William was a son of the settlers. For the first time since the independence, the long-standing Americo-Liberian political dominance was dramatically, interrupted. The event, which is the coup, shocked the nation, and it marked the end of an era that had lasted for more than 130 years. Many indigenous Liberians viewed the change as an opportunity, of course, for greater inclusion and reform. But governing a nation is never that simple. The years that followed brought new challenges, political tensions remained, economic difficulties persisted, the same old questions about democracy, governance, and national unity continued to share public debates. And even though Liberia had entered a new chapter of the indigenous ruling, the future remained uncertain, and unfortunately, even greater challenges lay ahead. For me, one of the most sobering aspects of Liberia's history is that some of the people who arrived seeking freedom had themselves experienced or were descendants of those who had experienced the injustice of slavery and discrimination in America. Yet they were the ones who were marginalizing and discriminating against the indigenous people. While the situation cannot be compared to slavery, it still reminds me of how deeply the legacy of slavery can affect individuals, societies, and generations. The trauma did not just disappear when slavery ended. Its effects continued to shape how people saw themselves, how communities interacted, and how power was understood. And that may be why the settlers consciously or unconsciously reproduced forms of exclusion, injustice when they gain power. This is not to excuse their behavior, but it helps us understand how deeply the wounds of slavery can run. It is also a reminder of the importance of healing and reconciliation. The story of Liberia continues, so stick around for the next episode. Now, listen to this young Liberian choir. Thank you.